Greetings, everybody. As you can see, I'm a bit burned up, and that is from my previous week being spent at Porkfest. And this is going to be kind of my annual tradition of making a Porkfest review vid. I've been doing this now for 3 years. Every year, a couple people come to Porkfest and say they watched my previous video about it, and it made a difference in them deciding to go, or perhaps a difference in them deciding not to go, based on how this review might end up being. Yeah, I think the Porkfest is a very interesting event. It's probably the biggest, most interesting libertarian event in the world. I say that with some cognition of the fact that, having not attended all the other ones, it's difficult for me to assert that with certainty. There's, of course, Mises Institute, the Mises U, there's the Property and Freedom Festival that Hans Merhaba puts off. There's Libertopia and Freedom Fest, although those, a lot of people do both, and I think I have a pretty good idea that they're a little bit different. It's also kind of not a barometer, but it's to some degree a qualitative and or quantitative gauge of the Free State Project, which is a very interesting phenomenon, and this is kind of a good periodic way to look at it. All of my subscribers who haven't gone, I think, have some degree of interest in it, so I think it's just something worth talking about. I'm going to come right off the bat with a negative. Relative to the previous 2 times that I've attended, so it's not necessarily evidence going all the way back to the beginning, but relative to last year and the year before, one aspect of Porkfest that was very lacking this year was the quality of the speakers, and if not of the speakers personally, of the lectures given. None of the ones that I watched were thought-provoking or very interesting. Many were extremely boring and even embarrassing, not just in what was said, but how it was said and who was saying it. If we look at last year, we had the likes of Michael Huemer, we had David Friedman, we had Joe Salerno, we had, I say we, perhaps not the best pronoun, Doug French. If we go the year before that, we have Stefan Molyneux. It's certainly entertaining, if not always the most insightful. Of course, we have Ben Powell and Dan D'Amico, and I'm probably forgetting a whole host of other ones. This year they had Joe Salatin, who, I have nothing against Joe Salatin, but he only has one thing to talk about, and its applicability is somewhat debatable. I mean, he definitely is a libertarian, but how much do we need to know about organic farming? Not that much. The other keynote speaker, well, there are 2 others. One was Nick Gillespie, and he's been kind of ridiculed in some circles as just kind of a very trendy, very libertarian light, beltway kind of intellectual. A guy who's just, you know, he's got his own little slick opinions, and, you know, maybe I agree with some of them, and maybe he can articulate them in a suitable fashion, but nothing very provocative, nothing very profound, and a lot of what I would frankly consider vulgar libertarianism. His speech was positively yawn-worthy. His entire metric for the success of libertarianism, I think, is extremely spotty and very difficult to agree with, basically, since we have more choices as consumers in certain products, like the flavors of Pop-Tarts, to use one example, that things are getting much better, that this is the libertarian moment, as his keynote was subtitled. Or that since things like homosexuality are, you know, less socially taboo, that this is, you know, again, while this is true for homosexuals as far as their homosexuality goes, it's not true then for the majority of people, and it's not true then for homosexuals in regards to any number of other economic activities that are restricted by and aggressed against from the state. So I don't know why this is such a big... Sure, we can be happy about it, absolutely, but to think that this is an indication of, you know, that libertarianism's moment is nigh, I just think it's wishful thinking and not all that intellectually rigorous. So the speech was very boring. Jeffrey Tucker is an interesting guy. I like Jeffrey Tucker. I think he is an intellectual. I think he is more than well-read enough and more than lucid enough to be considered a libertarian luminary. During his speech, which was, there were certain things that as he was speaking I kind of thought about, and I thought that this is interesting, but he didn't delve into them too directly, and it was mostly a lot of platitudes and cliches that we've all heard a million times. Now this might be a case of these people being used to speaking in environments that are more hostile. Salison said this explicitly, and that in an environment like Porkfest, you don't need to give the same speech you would give to, say, the Tea Party. This is also true, and I forget his name, but the CEO of Overstock.com also gave a keynote that was interesting to a point. A very interesting guy, definitely. He's the CEO of Overstock, but he was a philosophy teacher and had a pretty good understanding of many different types of philosophy, and he basically gave a genealogy of the libertarian movement, one that would be familiar with most Austro-libertarians, and other than making me kind of feel like I wanted to read Voltaire, maybe, apparently he referenced a letter from Voltaire to Rousseau, which sounds like it would be a good letter to read. There wasn't a ton of new information in there, and it's kind of upsetting because the reason he was there is because he recently kind of spearheaded the company he's in charge of, I just forget, Overstock.com, to accept Bitcoins. And it would have been very interesting had he gone into a lot of details about the decision-making process, how that's been going, what the reaction has been. I would have been, that's an area where he has probably more expertise than any other. In fact, Jeffrey Tucker, to his credit, asked what I think is probably the most pertinent question to ask this particular guy. I mean, yes, he knows a lot about philosophy. There's a lot of people at Porkfest who know a lot about philosophy. There's a lot of libertarians who know a lot about philosophy. There's not a lot of libertarians who are CEOs of Overstock.com or have that level of experience at Wall Street or with Bitcoin at that level. So Jeffrey Tucker asked a slew of questions basically regarding how that's going, and that was the only part of his speech where he really addressed that. He gave a whole speech about, like I said, the genealogy of liberalism, as he liked to call it, and it was all well and good, but a little been there, done that, not just for me, but anybody who is, not anybody, but most people who have the wherewithal to show up at Porkfest. And what would have been a very meaty, interesting debate, or not debate, but lecture on that topic became kind of an offhand, very brief question. Tucker's speech got me thinking, and it's probably worth making its own video about. Unfortunately, though, I don't think that was the point of his thing. He was just talking about how everything's great because people are making their own solutions to problems. They're solving their own problems, and they're not getting permission. And of course, some people are getting permission, but many people aren't. And the quintessential example here would be all the Bitcoin, especially, but all of the alternative currencies, which apparently is now just called altcoins, alt-currencies. I think is what people were saying. And that's nice and it feels good. What I did think was interesting, but he didn't really touch on, is the idea that there's a huge emphasis, and I'm, very much part of this, in the libertarian movement, to evangelize and to convince people, to persuade people that libertarianism is a good idea, a moral idea, should be allowed, should be encouraged. And this, despite the fact that we've had some really excellent communicators, some of whom have managed to make it into the mainstream, especially people like Ron Paul, but also people like Ayn Rand, the results, although not wholly negative, have been on the net disappointing. And an argument that Tucker didn't make, but I've heard another person, Patrick Freeman, make very explicitly is it would be better to simply create alternatives, and when people begin using them, without having to first be convinced of some kind of very, very technical, often counterintuitive political philosophy, they will simply start using them, and that this will de facto bring us closer to our end goals and also probably work towards persuading these people anyway. You know, very few people who become very big into Bitcoin, and this is not going to be an argument of the ultimate validity of Bitcoin. It's something in which I am still, although I really like Bitcoin, am very much in doubt about at this point. That would have been also an excellent topic, one that was not touched on at this conference, and it very much should have been. Different story, though. And I think if Tucker had gone at length to maybe juxtapose the two, the education versus the just go out and start doing stuff, that's actually a debate I think libertarians should actually have. And there have been papers written about it. I remember reading, Patrick Friedman wrote about it in the lead up to the Seasteading Institute. There's probably others who have talked about it. I think that is definitely something worth talking about, and it's actually something that's very relevant when we're talking about, say, the Free State Project. Unfortunately, that wasn't what his discussion was about. There were no questions fielded to that effect. Wouldn't have been time anyway. So, yeah, that left something to be decided. Now, there was another one that I watched was about paleo. It was interesting and good, and there were some good questions, and there's always little interesting factoids, and that was kind of like what I would have considered a typical kind of lecture from the previous 2 years, but in this year it kind of stood out as like the least bland and boring and most palatable. There was a lecture that I went to about a new cryptocurrency called NXT that is a little bit more than a cryptocurrency, and it was jaded by the fact that the main guy putting it on is somebody who's a heavy investor on this. He admitted this, that he's an initial investor in it, and if people start buying it, you know, he stands to make some money. He admitted this, so give him credit for that. But during the question and answers of this, some of the other panelists were very, very knowledgeable about cryptocurrencies, two of them in particular. And there sort of started to be a little bit of discussion about the flaws of Bitcoin and the promise of Bitcoin and the development of cryptocurrencies in the future. And honestly, I would have liked to seen an entire presentation to that effect, a debate about the validity of Bitcoin. That would have drawn a big crowd. Also, conspicuously absent, last 2 years that I've gone, there was a large contingent of early Bitcoin entrepreneurs, the likes of Shrem and Voorhees and a couple other guys who, I know Shrem has been arrested. I don't know if he's still in jail. Voorhees was fined, although apparently the profits that he's made in Bitcoin vastly dwarf the fines that he's paid. But he was not there this year. I don't know if he's left the country or if he's just busy with other business. I don't know. Their absence was conspicuous. I don't know if that's telling of any kind of nefariousness on any level, but their intellectual vigor and points of view were missed, at least by me. So really very disappointed in the speakers on net, far inferior to the previous 2 years, at least in their presentations. I think Tucker could do something that was interesting, more interesting than what he did anyway. Some of the other people who, for whatever reason, were not invited to give major speeches, didn't show up. I watched an abortion debate, which was absolutely atrocious. None of the people there, with the exception of a podcaster named Ben Stone, also known as the Bad Quaker, had any business sitting up on that stage. Just very frustrating. Now, this is all sounding very negative, and people, one thing we have to notice is I have a bias in that I don't like passively receiving information. I don't like listening to podcasts. I don't listen to the radio. Even content creators that I like and that I appreciate and who have made things that I really enjoyed, I don't do it because I usually am looking for very particular information. I want to know about something in particular. I want to understand one aspect of something better. And when I'm offered something else, unless it happens to be a topic that I'm also equally interested in or roughly equally interested in, it's going to bore me and feel like I'm wasting my time. You know, I'm working on building my worldview, and it's redundant to do information that I've already kind of covered, which is unfortunately what's going to happen a lot of the time at something like Porkfest. Although it shouldn't, Porkfest should be a venue for stuff that isn't Libertarianism 101, and it wasn't quite that bad, but I think most of you understand what I'm driving at when I say that. And on the other hand, you know, I'd like to know about China, and I want to know, obviously, when you go, they're not going to program just for what you like. But people, all these things will be posted online eventually, although it usually can take up to several months. One aspect about this, though, is the lectures and the presentations are only a relatively small fraction of what goes on at Porkfest, and I think that's an impression people can get. They watch all the debates and they figure, oh, it's like I went to Porkfest. No. Porkfest is much, much more than a series of lectures by presumably intellectual or libertarian intellectuals, in this case, although not many. And in the other regards of Porkfest, it was great. It was just as it always is. I met many old friends who I had not seen in a year or two. I met many people who I'd known online for several years but never had the chance to meet. I made new friends. There was apparently a whole community of gamers on the anarcho-capitalist subreddit that I had no knowledge of, and several of them showed up. You know, I met people from my home state. I met a lot of people that I otherwise wouldn't meet, and this was just an excellent chance to get to have good discussions. The side discussions at Porkfest, and I think most people who go will tell you this, tend to be much more interesting and invigorating, no holds bar, than what happens on the presentations, although some of the better ones can rise to that level. And in that sense, Porkfest definitely delivered. Here's a couple kind of side interesting things. One person who was there and who was on one panel and I wish had done much more was Jason Sorens. Now, Jason Sorens is the man who, when he was a student, I think an undergrad at Yale, kind of came up with the idea of the Free State Project. Now, it's an idea that had kind of been batting about, but he very much formalized it, and the incarnation of the Free State Project that exists today really can trace its genesis to his paper. And I'm assuming he's been to previous Porkfest. I don't think he'd been to the two that I had been to previously. And unfortunately, he was only in one panel, and it was a so-called Trigger the Move panel, which is basically something that's trying to get people to sign up to move to New Hampshire. I'll say this about Jason Sorens. He looks like he could be the antagonist in a movie rendition of Diary of a Wimpy Kid. Even though he's in his late 30s, he could pass for like a 12 or 13-year-old, even though he's a father. I really wanted to talk to him. He was around the campfire, but the last night he was playing with his little kids. It was so adorable that I did not want to intrude or interject. One thing you do notice at Porkfest is there's a lot of people who kind of lack tact in that regard. There's a lot of people who are polite, and there's a lot of people who, I don't know, it makes me uncomfortable when people just assume that everyone wants to talk to them, especially somebody who can be the center of attention normally. And I don't like to be that guy or girl, as it sometimes is, and I kind of let him be. And I wish I had a chance to talk to him, because he would definitely have a very interesting perspective on the Free State Project, one probably unique to him. I would be curious to know if standing here and looking at these many hundreds, if low thousands of people, which of course is actually only a fraction of the people who are there, or the people who have been affected by it in a significant way, you know, how does he feel? Is this where he thought it would be? Is this how he thought it would develop? How does he think it is developing? These are questions, unfortunately, I just did not have the opportunity to ask, and he did not have any kind of presentation where he discussed it. Now, what his presentation was about was to encourage people to sign up. Interestingly, he's coming up with like a new phrase that I don't really understand why you would use this. I don't think that I agree with it. It's that signing the pledge is not a promise to move. Basically, they're really at it. They really want to get 20,000 people to sign up. Right now, they have, I think, over 16,000, and it's their deep. The rule is, it's not a rule, but the plan is that once 20,000 people sign up, those 20,000 people will, within 5 years, move to New Hampshire. Now, as it's turned out, they don't have 20,000 signatories, but you know, something like 1,500 to 2,000 people have already moved, although they're not entirely sure. what the point in having the people sign up and then tell them that they don't have to move would be, it escapes me completely. Other than it would look good, it looks like they met their goal. Mark Edge, the co-host of Free Talk Live, who was also on this panel, asked a question, where did this 20,000 number come from? And basically Soren said it was the biggest number we thought we could get reasonably, and the number was based on half of the maximum membership of the Libertarian Party, which I can't believe that's accurate, that the maximum membership of the Libertarian Party was 40,000 members. But maybe that's correct, or maybe it was correct back in 2003. I don't know. So that was interesting. I really wish I had a chance to speak with him directly, and although he was available by the time I kind of formulated what I wanted to say and how I wanted to approach him, he was having too much fun with his kids. It really was quite adorable, to be honest. There was another very interesting thing that I completely did not expect, and while I was there, I saw a man who looked familiar to me, but who he looked like I assumed would never ever be at Porkfest. He looked like the former longtime head of the Republican Party in the state of Michigan, my home state. Now, that name, this person is not going to mean anything to you if I say that his name is Saul Anusis, but some of you would probably remember who he is even if you didn't remember his name, because back during the primaries, after one of the debates, I believe in the 2008 campaign, although it may have been the subsequent one, he said on national television on Fox News that Ron Paul should be kicked out of the Republican Party, that there was no place for him, and that he should just be gone. So this is a guy who, based on that, and based on everything else I knew about him, was an absolute rhino, a normal, unprincipled Republican who has no warm feelings for libertarianism. And so when I saw this man who looked just like him, I assumed that it can't be him, it's somebody else. However, before long, two younger men who appeared very clearly to be his sons were standing next to him, and one of them was wearing a Michigan State t-shirt. Now, Michigan State is the major university that not only that I attended, but happens to be in the town where Saul Anusis lives. And just before I graduated, some of his sons, although actually attended there, and I thought, okay, what are the odds that there's a man who looks like Saul Anusis standing next to kids, sons of his, who are attending a school that's by Saul Anusis? So I approached one of his sons. I asked him if he went to Michigan State. He said yes. Then I asked him if he was a Lithuanian, because the Anusis family is Lithuanian, to which he said yes. And then I asked if his last name was Anusis, and all three of them turned and looked right at me. And sure enough, yes, Saul Anusis, the man who said that Ron Paul should be kicked out of the Republican Party, spent most of his last week at Porkfest with the two of his sons. So I had a very interesting conversation with him. I was very demure. I didn't come out saying I'm an anarchist, and that probably deserves its own video. Interesting guy. Apparently he was a member of the Libertarian Party through much of its early history, through most of the 70s and into the 80s, before he became a Republican. That he was personal friends with Jason Sorens, although they had never met before now, and that he was intimately involved in the creation of the Free State Project, that he was in the original Yahoo group, and that blah, 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 blah. All of this was completely news to me and made no sense in my political worldview, and was quite frankly very shocking. And the thing is, this guy was completely unrecognized at Porkfest, because even though maybe describing what happened, some of you might remember it, I highly doubt you guys would put a face to it. Nobody there did. I did. I didn't bring up the Ron Paul thing, although Ron Paul's name came up. Basically, his point of view is that as much as he might agree with libertarian ideas, and apparently he agrees with a lot of them, there was a little media here, and we'll talk about that in a second. This is kind of an off-the-radar event for the country, and certainly for the GOP, outside of New Hampshire anyway. And someone like him, who's from a totally different region and more or less oriented with national aspirations, it makes no sense for him to be there, really, unless there was some kind of ideological pull. He said both of his sons had basically he has 4 sons total, but only 2 were there, have libertarian leanings. But basically, he said the Ron Paul people, and Ron Paul in particular, they want a seat at the table, but then they don't want to support their team when they don't win. Basically, that unless libertarians are willing to support someone like Mitt Romney or John McCain, then they shouldn't expect to get any support from the GOP. And all I can say is that giving support to people like that does nothing for the libertarian movement or the Libertarian Party. I made a video during the last Republican convention called Ron Paul Wins, GOP gives him a 5-minute video. The kind of changes we want to be seeing are not going to be changes that are simply rhetorical or just listed in the platform or just a completely meaningless, placatory memorial video. We want actual substantive changes, and it is possible that government could do this, but unless it does, to some degree, not necessarily everything that we want, unless it does, there is no reason for us to be enthusiastic. And if it does the opposite, if it does bad things, then we can't support it. And unfortunately, all the Republican winners are people who not only are not going to do what we want, but are going to do bad things. The only time the Republican Party does anything even remotely good is when it's in opposition, when it doesn't win. And then it will restrict the Democrats, slow the Democrats in some degree. I don't know how much. It'd be difficult to quantify or qualify. And yeah, what I would say though, what is encouraging about this is I think there are many people in the GOP who are potential libertarian converts. People who identify as either party is shrinking, and libertarians are in a great position to gobble up many of those people. And I don't just mean like in the polls or for an election, but to sway them intellectually. A Republican, an average Republican has very contradictory ideas, that verge from the Bill of Rights, a very minarchist libertarian kind of rhetoric, to very nationalistic, pro-military, pro-war kind of nationalism, essentially. And resolving those contradictions will leave you with either a National Socialist or with a Libertarian. And Libertarians have the rhetorical might, I think, to win that argument, at least with a lot of people, certainly not all. Anyway, very interesting to see him there. I'm curious about his relationship with Sorens. I know they did eventually get to meet. I don't know what they discussed. That was another thing I wanted to ask Sorens about. This is a guy, when he did this to Paul, his number was given out and people made all kinds of phone calls to his house, his personal home, and I do think it was a shock to him. It was interesting to see him there. Also, given the large amount of illegal substances that were being consumed, the alcohol, the drugs, very open, right in front of this guy. He didn't winch or recoil. He seemed very conversational. I talked to him for several hours. He talked to several other people. I don't know what he said. His presence there was anomalous. And then the other thing that I referenced recently is there was a reporter from the National Post there. I'm going to hold my breath on this. He spent most of the weekend there talking to people. From what it sounded like, and a good reporter is able to kind of mask their true intentions. They're very good at getting people to talk. But he seemed very friendly. He seemed very curious about what was going on. He kept asking, "What is this? What is that? What does this mean?" I talked to him for quite a long time. To the point I got a very distinct impression that anything he writes is very likely going to reference me. He took my name. He knows enough of my biography that anyone who read it would be able to know that it was me. He went and talked to Anusas too. I said, "Hey, that's the former head of the Michigan GOP." And he's like, "Are you sure?" I said, "I don't know. Looks like him." He was, "Go ask, and if he is, let me know." That'll be interesting. If he writes the paper, it'll be in the Washington Post, and it will probably be sometime next week. We went and looked up some of his other things he had written about the Tea Party, and they weren't hit pieces, so I'm fairly hopeful that this will be a good piece. We will see. He said he was very fascinated by what was going on. It was completely unlike anything he'd ever had any experience with, and that the individuals he was encountering were all very iconoclastic, and not all in the same way. So we'll see how that goes. I'm curious. I'm also a little bit nervous about what he's going to write. I have been screwed by reporters in the past, and that's assuming that anything in the articles actually ends up being about me, which he was there long enough that it could be about anybody. Let's see. So those are two interesting things that I did not expect to happen, but did. Let's see. Oh, there was one thing that they did that they had not done previously is there was a machine gun shoot. They brought in a company that owned machine guns and had a range, and one day for 4 or 5 hours went out, and anyone who wanted to could come along, and it was decently expensive, but shoot any of their guns. There was an Englishman, a guy from the UK, who came and asked them if they had sniper rifles, shotguns, 50 cals, machine guns, and the largest handguns and largest revolvers possible, to which he replied yes, and that he was able to fire all of them, and he was very happy. And this particular individual, I don't know if he was joking or not, but upon returning, he said he was going to pay the $350,000 to get his automatic American residency and just start living here in New Hampshire immediately. He may have been serious, he may not have been, it's hard to say. Definitely, though, he had a good time. And there were people from all over the world. I'll just have to say a lot of people from Australia, from the UK, from Mexico, from all over the United States, from Austria. Met a guy born in the United States but grew up in Austria, 2 Hungarian parents. Interesting story. Here he is at Porkfest in the U.S. military for 9 years. During which he became an anarcho-capitalist. Again, fascinating, eclectic group of people. Interesting conversations all around. Let's see, what else? What am I leaving out? There's a couple of pet peeves. There's certain things I really don't like about certain aspects of the libertarian movement that aren't, like, to its core or about it in some fundamental way that just kind of go with it that I don't like. And I don't want to, I think it would be petty to talk about them too much, so I'm going to just not do it in this video. There were some people who I previously had low opinions of, whose my opinion of has gone up some because of Porkfest. There are other people who my opinion is very low of, and I'm not going to, it's low enough that I'm not going to say who they are because I think it would give them more publicity than is due. And this is something I noted to the reporter. There's no official media here, but about half the people here are going to have a YouTube channel or a blog or a website or a podcast or a radio show. And other than Ian Friedman and Free Talk Live, which is financially sound and successful and reaches a very wide audience, and I have now twice encountered people who were aware of the Free State Project through Free Talk Live. One of the people I met actually on Grindr asked if I was in the Free State Project, and they knew that from Free Talk Live. And actually a coworker also had heard of the project. When I said I lived in New Hampshire for political reasons, he said, "Are you part of the project?" Thanks to Free Talk Live. But everybody else is kind of just has their own personal little microphone, and it's a little echo chamber, more or less, with kind of the same audience. I kind of joke that the audience of all the media produced there, most of that audience is probably right there at Porkfest. It's not entirely true, but you know, you get the picture. Towards the end, of course, you start making connections, getting people's phone numbers, so that you can continue to talk with them. A lot of people started asking, "Are you going to come again?" And my impression is that most of the people who went really did have a good time. For a lot of first comers, and many of them spoke in terms of coming again next year. So, you know, as pessimistic and kind of demure as my initial comments could be, it really is a very unique thing. And this is one thing, there are many flaws that I could point out about the Free State Project, and I've made videos to that effect on this channel before, and all those still stand, and there are other things that I could say that I haven't. And yet, it's the only thing that's actually happening. It's very easy to point and say, "Oh, look, you know, that's ugly," but we can't really point any place else to say, "Oh, look at the libertarian movement in Connecticut. How's that going?" Because there's nothing to report. There's a large clique of libertarians in New York City that was represented here again, not as well as before. Some of you know who you are. But I don't think there's any question that the libertarian population in New York, which is considerably large, is ever going to have even the smallest scintilla of effect on either that city or that state. Even like fucking Ayn Rand lived there, and look what she, Rothbard lived there. Look what he, you know, it. Yes, there's a lot of ANCAPs there, and I like them all, and they're all very intelligent, very good guys and girls, and yet there's nothing they have there that even comes close to what's going on in New Hampshire. And that is not to overstate what's going on in New Hampshire. I'm not going to do that. I'm just saying it's the only thing that where anything is actually happening, where there's actually stuff going on. Not just a conference, but every day, all the time. Yes, that's an advertisement. I qualify this absolutely. It's a personal thing. It's not an obligation. If you have reasons that you can't come for, and there's lots of good ones, a job, a family, a life, economic reasons, fucking political reasons, like the U.S. government doesn't allow you to come here if you don't have $350,000 to just get residency. It's a bitch for most people. All that I understand. But all that aside, it's the best thing going. Yes, seasteading is a great idea. It's not off the ground. These free cities, A, they're going to be only cities. B, it's looking like it's going to be hard, if not impossible, to get them to actually happen because the Latin American governments where they take place aren't going to go for that. Probably could change. I hope that it does. I really do. I hope all this stuff. Look, you know, 1,000 flowers bloom, but right now there's one flower pretty much blooming, and it's developing. You know, again, all the qualms I could say. And this, you know, I should have said this because during the Soren's talk and the Mark Edge talk, he said the 20,000 number. That's where we got that from. But we also estimated there's probably 10 times that number in New Hampshire already, who could easily be galvanized into libertarianism if they weren't already. And I think that's accurate. And that in the state, although this isn't the smallest state by population, it's close to the smallest state by population, that is a large enough number to be what they call quote-unquote libertarian veto. Not a majority by any means, but a large enough of a minority to be able to be a negating force in state politics. And apparently they've already prevented certain things from happening, and they point out that if they keep preventing things from happening, even if they don't prevent everything from happening, that would be wrong to say that they prevent every bad thing from happening, because they don't. That every year that they do this means that the cumulative difference compared to relative to other states becomes more and more pronounced. And that's assuming that their political power doesn't grow to the point where they aren't actually able to A, stop everything, or B, also begin repealing things. And I think that is actually possible. I'm not saying that it will happen, and I'm not saying that even achieving that is necessarily an end game, because that's not Ancapistan by any means. It would be a notable achievement, but not the ends we're all seeking. But even though we don't have the 20,000 people signed up or moved, the 20% libertarian veto may already have been achieved in the state legislature because of the degree of political activism, even though a large number of the movers here are explicitly anarchists, because they are so hardcore, so activist, so gung-ho, relative to your average person, that they have an effect entirely out of proportion to their numbers. And yes, that's not, again, I'm not characterizing like they've taken over or anything like that, but a profound effect. And that is interesting. I'm curious to see how that develops. I wish I could have, again, talked to Sorensen more about it another time, perhaps. Next time I'm in Dartmouth, I guess. But, yeah. There's a lot of libertinism, and there's a lot of like drug use. It's just, I mean, most of you know that I'm a teetotaler, that I don't even drink, and that's not a moral, you know, critique of those who do. It's just, you know, I don't find it particularly interesting to have a lot of people doing acid all week, but you know, and that's not the only thing that happens at Porkfest either. But yeah, they also sell these great shirts, by the way. Some of you are probably wondering about this one. It says, "Where's my change? Dude, where's my change?" And I thought it was a lovely shirt. I had to buy it. Yes, sir. I didn't buy anything else other than food. On the last day, a particular Canadian began begging me to, not begging, but asking to buy as much of my silver as he possibly could, so that he could avoid taxes on it, essentially, and because he had the money to do it. Pretty much everyone who went there for the first time, I would ask them if things were what they expected. They basically said yes, and more or less, and that they had a really good time and they look forward to coming back again. So, yeah, I hope that they get better speakers, or the speakers do a better job. Obviously, there's many things that could be said about the Free State Project. Not all of them good, but in the end, there's nothing else even remotely similar to it going on anywhere in the world, at least to my knowledge. And it has a degree of inertia. It exists and it's perpetuating. It's going on. People like Sorens and the nominal head of the Free State Project, or even the Free State Project as an organization, are, it seems like they're becoming vestigial. They're becoming less and less significant to what's going on. I don't know if that was the intent, but it's not a surprising outcome given the political philosophy that encompasses this. So, again, fascinating event. Look forward to feeling my sunburn melt away. I've only got a few more days before I have to return to work. Interesting note on that, actually. It sounds like they are completely replacing every component of the rig, including all the parts that caused the accident that hurt me. And I'm willing to bet that that is the reason why it's happening. I'm hearing this remotely from afar, but yeah, that was kind of a little surprise that I got when I was at Porkfest. So, for those of you out of the country too, I mean, all the Brits loved it. The open carry, the gun availability, something they don't have the free speech. Shirts like the one I'm wearing probably would not be considered legal in the UK, although it's not necessarily to say that you get tackled and killed by the police. Oh, maybe. Yeah, it's always fun to make new friends, to reconnect, to get to talk to people you've known for a long time. Several of my subscribers came, said hello, made contact with them. Good discussions. Really, I had my misgivings about going just because I've gone twice before, and I often wonder, shouldn't I do something different? I've long contemplated a trip to Europe. I've kind of set the pieces in place that I can do that relatively easily at this point. And, I was kind of like, wow, Porkfest or Europe, and I decided Porkfest, and I think it was the right choice. And then I tried to go to the top of Mount Washington, which is actually visible from Porkfest. You can see it, although it's 30 or 40 miles away. And I couldn't actually go to the top because they were having an auto race on it today, so that was a little disappointing. But anyway, I got a couple of little videos I want to do here in the next couple days. If there's anything that I mentioned here that anyone thought would like to hear more elaboration on, let me know. If there's anyone here who has thoughts about Porkfest they'd like to share, let me know. Either people who have attended in the past or this year or both. Any questions people have, go ahead and feel free to ask. I'm an advocate of all this, but I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I'm not going to lie. I'm not going to trump it up, which is, I think, something sometimes Free Talk Live tends to do. I'm not a good salesperson. I'm not a good marketer. I kind of feel ethically wrong to mislead people about what it is they need and don't need. But it is an interesting thing, and I think it's a good thing. And I'm very interested to see how it grows. This goes back to what I was thinking when Jeffrey Tucker was talking about. This is actually doing something. Maybe not the most efficient thing and the only thing, certainly, but it's something. And it's palpable. It really is. It really is palpable. And even when you're not at Porkfest, when you're living among your peers, and one of the people I met was a couple from Massachusetts, only half an hour away, and they said that they've never met another ANCAP before they came to Porkfest. Never. And a lot of people, a recurrent theme from people who came from all over the world, and a man from Australia told me this. I just like that I can come to a place where I don't have to argue about everything. Still have great discussions, and we get very, it's funny that we can agree on 99%, and that 1% we don't agree on, we can argue all night about it. And with all the rhetorical might that our politicians have lacked for 150 years, and still it's not. It's like there's less acrimony than there is with a single day, with a single paragraph of interchange about politics anywhere else in the world. And maybe that's not a solution to the world's problems, but it certainly feels good when you get the chance to do that. It's certainly encouraging, and I think that's why so many people continue to return, year after year, and why many of them, if not all, make the decision to move and to live in New Hampshire. So anyway, I will talk to you all later, and have a good night. If I can turn this off.